Nick Majerison here, welcome to Top Med Talk. So we're going to give you a conference highlight. This time it's Sir Bruce Keogh's address, which took place at EBPOM 2018 at the Institute of Engineering and Technology. Now, Sir Bruce Keogh, a giant in the world of healthcare, British surgeon and physician and Medical Director of the NHS and National Medical Director of the NHS Commissioning Board. That is, of course, the UK's National Health Service. He stepped down at the beginning of the year and he was good enough to address us at EBPOM 2018. We were delighted to have him there, and this is one of our proudest moments here on Top Med Talk. I'm going to play you a short clip now, only about 10 minutes long, but the fuller version of this talk is available on the website, topmedtalk.com. If you click on this podcast's show notes, there's a link straight to it, and it's an excellent listen. A massive highlight for us here at Top Med Talk. We were honoured to have this talk on our podcast stream. So have a listen, see what you think.
Top Med Talk.
I think the tectonic plates of politics, leadership, power, and public expectations are shifting, not just in this country, but around the world. We're seeing increasing dissatisfaction with the institutions of government, the institutions that are meant to be looking after people, whether they happen to be in Europe or whether they happen to be in Washington. This is fueled by the economic consequences of the 2008 global financial crisis, coupled with the technological power of instant communication. And so it's breeding a sense of localism and a sense of commentary and a sense of different expectations. We've seen it with the election of Donald Trump in North America. We've seen it with the Brexit referendum in this country, and we've seen it to some extent with the junior doctors signalling discontent about not just the way they were being treated in the NHS, but equally, I think, concern about the future of the National Health Service. And Darwin is attributed as having said, and I don't think it was him, but he gets the credit anyway, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but it's the most adaptive. And I find myself thinking there are many healthcare systems around the world. None of them are perfect. We do not have a perfect healthcare system. We never will because of the nature of the progression of science and healthcare. And all are struggling with pretty serious climate change. They're having to deal with the winds of changing demand. So the demand for our NHS going up about 4% per year. Rapidly escalating cost of drugs. Our annual drugs bill is about £16 billion. It's going up at 7% per year. So that's 7% of a big number. And changing public, professional, and political expectations. And it's also having to deal with the darkness, all of them, of financial constraint, whatever form that might take. But the United States don't have enough money to run their healthcare system. You see that being debated in the Senate. Germany don't have enough money. France doesn't have enough money. We don't feel we have enough money, and people in Zimbabwe don't feel they have enough money. So the solution lies somewhere in the intellectual capital of people working in healthcare systems. But we've been here before, so given that this is sort of the last talk of the day and nobody really wants to hear too much data, let me just ask you to imagine it was 1947 and we were thinking of establishing a health service. The first 3 months of the year saw a terrible winter with a shortage of fuel, so people were getting cold. April saw the worst floods in the country for 53 years. In May, the exchange rate with the dollar changed, so that the price of foodstuffs went up. It had also gone up as a consequence of the floods and the prolonged winter. And bread was rationed for the first time, having never been rationed before. In September, the meat ration was reduced from what it had been during the war. The bacon ration was halved in October, and in November, potatoes were rationed. Not a great time to have a big debate about spending a load of money on a health service, you might argue. But actually, it leads you to the hypothesis that great things can come out of hard times. And I was traveling on the tube recently, and I bumped into an old, well, he's not old actually, but a consultant colleague from St. Thomas's. It was about 11 o'clock in the evening, so I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions as to what kind of nick he was in. But he was sitting on the other side of the tube, and he leant over, he said, "Bruce," he said, "how bad do things have to get before we actually change?" And there's some merit in that particular question. So I'm going to invite you just to sit back and think, do we have a track record of being able to do stuff in this country? Can we change? I'd like you to think about our contribution to global medicine in terms of science. Imagine you lived in a country that had postulated the theory of evolution, that had unraveled the double helix, that held the intellectual property for most nucleic acid chemistry, that had developed the chemistry behind the contraceptive pill, that had discovered antibiotics, that had done the first stem cell transplant, the first blood transplant, that had developed the ability to stop and start the heart electively, which was the basis of my previous specialty, or in technology that had invented the clinical thermometer, the intraocular lens, the artificial hip, the laryngeal mask, the ECG, the MRI scanner or the CT scanner. You might think, well, that country's made a reasonable contribution to global medicine. Imagine if that country also had 4 of the top 10 universities in the world, although, to be fair, some are drifting down. But it's good for the purposes of the talk. Imagine also if that country had twice as many Nobel Prize winners for medicine or physiology per capita of population than any other major Western country. Imagine also if, in terms of publications, it had 1% of the world's population, funded 3% of the world's research, produced 6% of the world's medical research papers, and 16% of the highest ranked papers, highest cited papers. You would think that's not a bad country to pursue a medical career in. Imagine also if you thought that country ranked number 2 or 3 on the Global Innovation Index put together by INSEAD and the World Intellectual Property Organization. You'd think that's okay. And then if you thought, well, that country also has 5,000 life science companies employing 235,000 people with a £64 billion turnover, and a pharma industry and medtech industry responsible for 10% of all the country's exports, you might think that's not bad, given that financial services are our biggest export. You think that's not bad. But if you could link all of that to the biggest semi-integrated healthcare system in the world, you could start to conjure up a hypothesis that we could, with a following wind, have the best healthcare system in the world. And I still believe that's possible. I think it's a stone's throw away. There'll be hours of debate about the size of the stone, the type of the stone, the geology of the stone, how big it is, where it is, who's going to throw it, and how far. But the point is, there is a stone. And I think we're in just as good a position, I'll come right back to this at the end, as any other healthcare system to tackle some of the problems. We have quite a significant substrate. We have 440 million pharmacy visits a year, 360 million GP visits, 100 million visits to outpatient departments, 100 million visits to community services. We have 24 million telephone consultations. We have about 9 million ambulance journeys. We have 16 million admissions to hospital and about 24 million attendances at A&E a year. So there's a lot of activity going on. And on top of that, we have 1 billion prescriptions a year. There is more activity through the NHS spine in terms of transactions by a factor of several-fold. I've heard 2 figures. I've heard 2 and 4, so I'm not quite sure which one's true. But in either event, it's big. 2 or 4-fold as many transactions as go through all the debit and credit cards in the country in a day. And that gives you some idea of the magnitude of the operation that we're involved in. Now, change is complex, and one of the reasons it's complex is because we have, frankly, such a fragmented NHS. We have a lot of different organisations. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. We have 137 acute trusts, 17 specialist trusts, 56 mental health trusts, 35 community trusts, 10 ambulance services, 7,800 falling GP practices, and 853 private providers of services on over 7,000 sites. So trying to get coherence of change in that number of organisations, all of which have their own leadership and their own views, is quite tricky. Now, I was appointed Medical Director of the Health Service in 2007, and in March 2008, the global financial crisis struck.
Top Med Talk.
And don't forget, you can meet the Top Med Talk team. All you need to do is turn up at one of our events. Check out ebpom.org for more details. ebpom.org. Our next big event is between the 28th and the 30th of September in Chicago. That's EBPOM USA, the Chicago Masters Course, Perioperative Care Practicum. Between the 28th and the 30th of September. ebpom.org for more details. That's ebpom.org.